All right, let's take a look at chapter 20. This is 20.1 and yeah, all the way through to the end of 20.1. I love the way Duff introduces and takes care of these conditionals. He really tells you what's important and doesn't bother you with a bunch of things that aren't important. I particularly like that first paragraph, which I won't read to you, but be sure and read it because it's a really helpful introduction to this topic. Now, there are two technical terms that Duff and everybody else use for conditional sentences. Conditional sentences are ones where we have if this, then this. And the if part of the sentence is called the protasis, and the then part of the sentence is called the apodosis. Now, I constantly forget which is the protasis and which is the apodosis. So I'm not going to use those terms. I'm going to use the if clause and the then clause. And that way we're all clear on what we're talking about. But I want you to know the names for those clauses and even at least how we pronounce it in the United States. I'm sure it gets pronounced differently all over the world, so that if you're in another class or if you're looking this information up in a grammar book, you know the technical terms that you're going to need to use. Okay, so a conditional sentence has two parts, the if clause and the then clause. And the way it works is if the if part is true, then the then part is going to happen. And I just made another conditional clause by explaining that. Now, that's just the basic conditional, and we've been translating those since chapter 5. You know that the word for if in Greek is a, and a plus a verb in the indicative mood, that's the if clause. And then we have the then clause, that's just going to be any mood or tense. Any verb is fine there. And it means if the if clause is true, then the then clause will also be true. Now, Greek can play with that basic structure in two different ways that we're going to look at. Again, like Duff says, it can get more complicated than that. It was more complicated than that in ancient Greek, but in the Bible, there are really only these three basic kinds of clauses that you need to know about. So you can suggest that the whole thing, the whole if then, is unlikely or uncertain or indefinite. You can add this element of uncertainty that the subjunctive brings. And if the speaker wants to do that, instead of using the word for if, which is a, the writer is going to use a different word, which is aeon. And in that if clause, it's going to start with aeon for if, and then the mood is going to be subjunctive. And then the then clause is just going to be like always, it's going to be any mood or any tense. Now, what this does is it adds an element of indefiniteness. So a basic conditional using a and the indicative for the if clause would be something like, if you like Greek, you will learn it. I'm speaking to you, you know who I'm speaking to. It's a specific it's a specific event, a specific time, a specific context. That's what I was looking for, a specific context that's going on. But if I want to make it a little more indefinite, in Greek, I would use aeon with the subjunctive, and I might say something like, if someone enjoys rules and patterns, they like Greek. So again, it's still the case that if the if clause is true, the then clause is going to be true. But now we've added this element of, this could just be a general statement. I'm not really thinking about anybody in particular. So I'm going to jump over the contrary to fact and come back to that in a minute and just look at the examples at the bottom there of, and I haven't filled in the page numbers, so it looks like maybe 227. We have Galatians 3:29. If you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring. It starts with an A, Both of the verbs are, well, actually, there is no verb in the first if clause, but in the second clause, there is. We have este, just a normal indicative present, and this is a basic condition. If you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring. And we have the you that kind of grounds this in I'm talking to somebody and I know who I'm talking to. And this is a real thing that's happening now that that's in the context in which I am. 1 Corinthians 8:3, if someone loves God, he's known by him. Now, here, I think because of the tis, the speaker could have chosen to use aeon and made it a little less definite, but the author Paul chose not to. He chose to say a and use agapa here as the indicative present. And if a certain person loves God, he is known by him. If this, then that. Luke 23:37, we have another a if, and then the me verb, you are. So if you are the king of Israel, save yourself. See, we have an imperative in the then clause. That's perfectly fine. We can have other moods. And this is, again, it's a basic conditional. And then we have Luke 11:19. If I cast out demons by Beelzebul, by whom do your sons cast them out? Again, indicative verbs, present tense in this case. We have the ae, and it's just a basic condition. But if we want to add a note of uncertainty, or if the Greek speaker or writer did, then instead of using a, we use aeon. So if you turn the page, we have some examples of indefinite conditions. So Matthew 9:21, if I touch his cloak. So we have aeon, and then apsomai rather, is subjunctive. And so we have this sense of, if only I touch his cloak, I will be saved. But I'm not real sure I'm going to be able to. There's this uncertainty about it. John 14:14, if you ask me for anything in my name, I will do it. So the other reason these are uncertain is because the then clause is set in the future. I don't actually know if it's going to happen because I can't see the future. So if you ask me for anything in my name, I will do it. Now, one would think, since that's Jesus speaking, it would be pretty definite. But here, the sense of uncertainty or indefiniteness comes from nobody's asked him for anything yet. 1 Corinthians 14:14, because if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays. Again, we have aeon with the subjunctive, and there's this sense of indefiniteness. We can almost say that this is a general statement, meaning if the idea here might be that if anyone prays, and he's using himself as an example. 1 John 2:15, if someone, this one's clear because it has tis, but again, it's aeon with, notice that agapa is in the subjunctive here. We know that because of the aeon, but it's exactly the same form as we saw a minute ago. If someone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. The uncertainty here comes from, we don't know who we're talking about. We're just talking in generalities. Now, there's not a huge difference here. And to be honest, I have not found this to be a particularly useful point of grammar. They get translated pretty much the same way. And in context, it's pretty obvious what the author means. You may find it different. You may find it really useful. So I would love if in the future you find these different kinds of conditionals, particularly between the a and the aeon. If you find something really useful, feel free to send me an email and let me know so that I can tell future students. But for me, it doesn't change how we translate it. It's just a conditional. And okay, one of them is a little more definite than the other. What is important to note is the contrary to fact conditions, because here there's an on in the then clause. And so we don't know about it till we get there, but otherwise it starts just like a basic condition, A plus indicative. But then when we get to the on the then clause, we get on plus the indicative. And here the idea is that the if clause is not being fulfilled. Nobody's doing that. It's not happening. And because it's not happening, then the then clause isn't going to happen. So if you had liked Greek, you would have learned it. And that would is how we're going to translate the then clause with the on in it. Now, I do want to look at one of these footnotes before I move on. Notice actually two of them. Footnote 4 points out that this contrary to fact means that the speaker doesn't think the if clause is true. The if clause might be true. If it weren't raining, I would go for a walk. That implies that I think it's raining. You might look out the window and answer, but it's not raining. Let's go for a walk. I can be wrong about what I think, but it's about what I think is true and not true. The second thing is the tenses are in footnote 5. In the if clause and the then clause, the imperfect is used for references to present time and the aorist for references to past time. Time is a little odd in conditionals, and just follow that rule, and that should be helpful. Now look on the next page to the unfulfilled conditions. John 5:6. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me. Note the on in the then clause there in the Greek. We have a plus the indicative in the first clause. And the idea here, of course, is that you don't believe in Moses. And since you don't believe in Moses, you don't believe in me. But what Jesus actually says is, if you believed in Moses, you would believe me. 1 Corinthians 2:8 is similar. We have a plus the indicative, and then we have uk on. For if they had known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But they didn't know, so they did crucify him, right? And then Hebrews 8:4, therefore, if he were on earth, he would not even be a priest. So a with the indicative and then on. And the idea is that he wasn't on earth. I don't know who we're talking about in context here in Hebrews. But if he were, the idea is that he's not on earth. And so whether or not he's a priest, it doesn't even come into it, right? But if he were on earth, he would not even be a priest. So notice the on every time in the then clause. It starts with a, just like normal, just like you've always seen. And when we translate it, we make sure that we translate the verb in the then clause with a would. We'll see the practices either in another video or in class. We'll see how my time goes. Send me a note if you have any questions. Thanks.